This is the third in this set of three videos telling the story of the early rise of Methodism. How does a college fellow, John Wesley, end up beginning what turns into this Methodist church that we are part of today, this distinctive way of following Jesus. I think it's worth noting about Methodism that, to the best of my knowledge, it is the only church tradition, the only denomination that exists out that its roots come out of a concern for practicality. What are the methods we're going to use to follow Jesus more faithfully in a way that changes lives? It's not rooted in a particular argument about the nature of communion or how to read the Bible. It is rooted in John Wesley's focus on being a practical theologian, on being someone who's focused on what practically does it look like to follow Jesus. And so as we pick up the story of John Wesley, as he's returning from face planting in Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, he comes back to England and he sort of picks up where he had left off. He starts meeting with some of his friends from college, and he doesn't have to go find a job because he is he's a priest in the Church of England. And so he can sort of preach wherever is needed. He can fill pulpits for priests who need to take the Sunday off, and that's enough to support him. So he doesn't have to take a job, a 9-to-5 job, so to speak, and so he has a lot of free time, and he starts going to meetings, religious meetings. What I don't think I'd appreciated before sort of going over the history of Methodism this time, I've looked at it before, obviously, but what I really think I understand in a new way this time is that this is happening during a sort of a movement that was happening across the Western world. In America, we call it the Great Awakening, this time in the early 18th century where the camp meetings were starting and Christianity was sort of spreading across America. America was becoming the nation of Christians that we sort of know it to be today, even though that's a different changing dynamic. But and so that same thing was happening in Britain. And so Wesley was going to these religious societies that were meeting, these religious gatherings, people gathering on a weekly basis, in the same way that like we go to scout meetings, Boy Scout meetings, or like 4-H or Legion or the various civic groups. That was really driving a lot of what was happening in Wesley's day. It is while Wesley is going to one of these such meetings that he has this moment that he records. He says he felt his heart to be strangely warmed, that I felt that I did trust in Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. And so, like, for him, this is this moment where something he had been thinking for years, like he knew the gospel, but it sort of sank in, and he had this real moment of practical experience of, I follow Jesus and I am forgiven. And that sort of ends up powering him for the rest of his life. He keeps on coming back to this moment and pondering, like, shortly thereafter this moment, he asks himself, was he a Christian before this moment? And he would say, nah, I really wasn't. And then later in life, he's preaching until he's in his 80s. Like, so we have his sermons that develop over time. And later on, he starts to see, he was a Christian. He was following Christ. This was just a new moment, a new part of that experience. And so this is part of, like, as I said, Wesley is a practical theologian. He wants to really be able to articulate what practically does it mean to follow Jesus. And so this leads him, he ends up coming up with some terminology, which is, I think it's useful to know. He talks about grace, that is, grace is anything God gives. And he talks about prevenient grace, which is what God is doing to reach out to us. If we read through the Old Testament, you read of all these times that God keeps on reaching out, sending the patriarchs, calling the patriarchs, sending the prophets, sending Moses to give the law, sending again and again and again, reaching out to God's people. And this culminates in the sending of Jesus. And God keeps on reaching and sending and trying to initiate. That's prevenient grace. It's God reaching out for us when we would be lost without God reaching out for us first. So God, we are being sought by God. So that's prevenient grace. And then there's justifying grace, the idea that we accept that we are forgiven, that we accept that we are part of God's family. We accept that we are going to follow Jesus as part of the church that is Jesus's. And so then the third sort of chunk of, and so that is like an experiential moment. Like prevenient is the first chunk of life if we aren't raised in the church, and then justifying, and then sanctifying grace, the grace of God acting in our lives so that we are becoming ever more like Jesus, ever more saintly, ever more sanctified. And that's a lifetime of doing, such that by the end of our lives, we could be called to be perfect. It says in the Bible, be perfect as the Lord your God is perfect. And Wesley wants to take that seriously, but also be practical about it. And so he doesn't understand that to mean that we're going to be perfect and that we never make a mistake. But what he says is to be perfect is to be perfect in intention, to be perfect in love. Like, I would never intentionally hurt another. Now, I might hurt another, but I would not ever intend to hurt another. And that's perfection in love. And that's part of what Wesley, his understanding he develops. He sees that just like you can mess up a relationship with a family member, you can mess up your relationship with God. He calls it backsliding. Like if I walked over to the house that I share with my family and I lit it on fire and burned it to the ground, that would damage my relationship with my family, right? And that would be a bad thing. And we can damage our relationship with God in the same way. And so that again is it's contra. It's against what some of the other people of that time and even today are reading scripture and seeing. It's arguing that once you're saved, you're always saved. And Wesley would say, you know what? I've seen too many people mess up and make decisions and walk away. And that's what we experience in real life. So we need to grapple with that as a church. So what happens after this? Wesley has this experience of that he truly is going to follow Jesus, and he is forgiven, and he is loved, and he has assurance of this. And he isn't the one who's the best preacher. He isn't the one who has the original ideas. He's the one who is the good manager. Like George Whitefield, another fellow of the time, he was the one who could preach and get thousands of people together. Wesley would preach, he'd get hundreds of people together. Wesley preached outside because Whitefield told him. It wasn't Wesley's idea originally. And what happens is Wesley preaches outside, and it's like a big deal. Like I think of, if you know the Muppet Sam the Eagle and how the American way, like that stiff upper lip, like this is the right thing to do, right way to do things. That's like the British culture of the time. There's the right way to do things, and it's not the right way to do things to preach outside. That's not how people are supposed to hear a sermon. But Wesley does when George Whitefield tells him, you got to preach outside if you're going to reach people, Wesley's willing to do it. This is happening in the middle of the shift from agrarian economy to an industrial economy. This is the Industrial Revolution that happens in the 18th century. And so people are moving from farms. Like in Missouri, we have century farms. If you had a farm in your family for a century, that's impressive. They would laugh at that in 18th century Britain, because there they would have like millennia farms that had been in their family for 1,000 years. And so this is this moment of great social upheaval as people are leaving the farm and coming to the city to work. And it's a lot of change because they're going from a sunrise cycle, they get up with the sun, go to bed with the sun, to a factory cycle where they have to be there at a certain time. And they've never had to live with a clock before. So a lot of change. And so Wesley would go out and he would preach on the road running from the town to the factory. And so he would catch the whole shift walking to work. And some people would stop and listen to him. And other people were doing this as well. The difference is Wesley gave them something to do next. Right? He said, and if you want to do this, he bought a preaching house in Bristol. he bought a place where people could gather, and he would say, okay, you group of people, you 8 people, you meet on Monday at 8, and you group of people, meet Monday at 7, and you group of people, you meet in the other room at Monday at 7, and then his job was to go to the lay people who were in charge of that gathering, where the person like facilitating the discussion, saying like, how is it with your soul? Where are you experiencing God? What are you struggling with? And it's not so much that they were teaching as they were just making sure the meeting happened. And the way they paid for that building, again, Methodism is practical above all else, is every person who came to one of those meetings had to bring a penny, and the lay person leading the meeting was on the hook for as many pennies as there were people, even if someone who came to the meeting didn't have their penny for that week, and because they had to pay for the mortgage on that building. Wesley had his income was enough to feed himself, but he didn't have the money for real estate. And so that is where, like, Wesley, he's willing to do what it takes. He's not the one who invents these field preaching, but he's the one who manages it well and gives people something to do next. And so that becomes essential. He starts organizing and managing. He puts together a school called Kingswood to help people be able to get education. He puts together a book called Modern Physique so people can have access to healthcare. He organizes these small groups, these classes, and then they are invited to go and visit people like debtors' prison and go help their neighbors in some practical way. This takes time. This is all happening in one or two cities in England over the course of a decade or two. It starts to build up over time as he sort of, okay, let's go to this city. Okay, let's go to this city. And then he needs help with overseeing this. So he brings in a few other preachers, but he's also training lay people to be able to go and be able to oversee this. And he wants to help them do this well, and so he starts writing up his sermons so that he can send his sermons with people so that you can trust someone to preach a sermon. They don't necessarily have to be good enough to write their own, but they just have to be good enough to preach something Wesley had already written. And so he starts doing that, and he starts using some women for this. And he tells women, like, you can go, don't try to like look like you're preaching, but try to go out and I trust you to oversee these classes. Don't stir the pot. I mean, again, it's a practical thing. He needs more leaders. These women are willing to do it. He asks them not to make it hard, but just go and get the job done. This is the method of Methodism. And so this is, and then Wesley spends the rest of his life sort of running this growing reform movement that happens in England. Again, the strength, I think the key here is that the strength was in the lay people. The strength of the Methodist movement is not in pastors who are amazing. It's in lay people who are committed and willing to gather on a weekly basis. And the fast forward from 1730, 40, 50, which is where we've been, to fast forward, it's in 1930 in American Methodism that the shift happens where we go from being a church driven by classes of lay people, that the pastor shows up on occasion. That's when we started putting pastors in one location, and that is when classes started to fade. And that's when Methodism went from being a church that was growing to a church that wasn't. And so I think my analysis, my hope for the future of Methodism is that we need to be able to use both. We need to be able to have pastors who aren't the center of everything, and then have lay people who are committed to having weekly gatherings where they will be holding each other accountable to, how are you finding God in your life? How are you praying? Like, what are we doing? How are we struggling? What can we do together as people who follow Jesus? These small groups, these classes, they were the backbone that grew Methodism, and when they faded, that's when Methodism started to fade. And I think, as I said, I think our future is going to be found in holding together some of the advantages of having people, hopefully like myself, who are committed to the good of the church as a career and a lifetime, but understanding that the goal is that people like myself need to facilitate lay people who are the backbone of the church. Like, I'm just a guy who talks unless there are people in the pews who are willing to do something about following Jesus. They're the strength of the church. This has been sort of my 3-session overview of British Methodism. We'll probably come back and do a couple chats about American Methodism maybe next spring. We'll have to see. If you've been listening this long, thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I love a good question. Have a good day.